The average person sees $1 million and thinks freedom. The top 1% see it and think leverage. While you're calculating how to pay off debt, they're acquiring more of it strategically. While you're trying to escape risk, they're engineering it. The difference isn't about intelligence or work ethic. It's about something far more unsettling. They've rewired how their brain processes reality itself. Money didn't change them. The psychology came first. And that's exactly what separates those who build empires from those who work inside them. If you're into this kind of content, subscribe to Just 1% and comment your favorite topic about the top 1% mindset in 2008. When the entire global economy was collapsing, when banks were failing and people were losing their homes, a small group of investors did something that made zero sense to the average person. They bought aggressively while everyone else was panic selling. These people were moving capital into assets at rates that seemed insane. Real estate, stocks, businesses on the edge of bankruptcy. And here's the thing, they weren't gambling. They weren't being reckless. They were operating from a completely different psychological framework than everyone around them. The average person in 2008 saw the crash and thought, I need to protect what I have. The 1% saw the exact same crash and thought, this is the buying opportunity of a lifetime. Same information, same headlines, completely different brain processing, and that difference made some people billionaires while others never financially recovered. But why? What's actually happening in the brain of someone who sees disaster and thinks opportunity? That's not optimism. That's not just risk tolerance. It's something way more fundamental. It's a rewiring of how they perceive reality itself. Let's start with something most people don't want to hear. The 1% don't think they're special. They don't think they're smarter than you. In fact, many of them will openly admit they're not the smartest people in the room. What they do believe, and this is critical, is that the rules of money are fundamentally different than what society teaches. They believe the game is rigged, but not in the way most people think. It's rigged in favor of anyone willing to learn the actual rules. And most people are playing a completely different game without even realizing it. Here's where it starts. The average person treats money like it's scarce, because for them it is. You work, you get paid, you spend it, it's gone. That's the loop. The 1% treat money like it's a tool that creates more tools. It's not something you earn and protect. It's something you deploy. You don't ask, how much do I have? You ask, what can this do? That shift from viewing money as a resource to viewing it as a mechanism is the first psychological break from normal thinking. And once that shift happens, everything else changes. Let me give you a concrete example. A regular person gets $50,000. They think, I can pay off debt, maybe save some, maybe take a vacation. A person with 1% psychology gets the same $50,000 and thinks, can I leverage this into $500,000? Not through luck, not through gambling, through structure. They're asking, can I use this as a down payment? Can I invest it into something that cash flows? Can I use it to buy equity in something undervalued? The money isn't the end, it's the beginning of a sequence. And that sequence mindset is something the 99% almost never develop because they were never taught to think in sequences. They were taught to think in transactions. Now let's talk about risk, because this is where the psychological gap becomes almost disturbing. Normal people are risk averse because loss hurts more than gain feels good. This is called loss aversion, and it's hardwired into human psychology. Losing $100 feels worse than gaining $100 feels good. It's not logical, but it's deeply emotional. The 1% have learned to override this, not by becoming emotionless, but by reframing what loss means. To them, loss isn't failure. It's data. It's expensive education. It's the cost of finding out what doesn't work so they can focus on what does. There's a concept in finance called asymmetric risk. It means you risk a little to potentially gain a lot. A venture capitalist might invest $100,000 into 10 startups. 9 might fail completely. But if one becomes a unicorn worth $1 billion or more, that single win covers all the losses and makes them wildly profitable. The average person looks at that and sees 9 failures. The 1% see 1 massive success and 9 learning experiences. They're not afraid of the 9 failures because they've structured the game so that the 1 success makes the failures irrelevant. That's not reckless. That's engineered risk. And it requires a brain that has completely divorced itself from the emotional sting of losing. Here's where it gets dark. To think like this, you have to kill part of yourself. You have to turn off the part of your brain that feels embarrassment when you fail. You have to stop caring what people think when your project crashes. You have to become okay with being wrong publicly, repeatedly, expensively. And that process, it destroys relationships. It makes you cold in situations where normal people are warm. It makes you calculating when others are emotional. The 1% aren't born this way. They train themselves into it. And there's a cost. Let me introduce you to the first law of 1% psychology, the Inversion Principle. Most people think forward. If I do this, I'll get that. The 1% think backward. They start with the outcome they want and reverse engineer the steps. Elon Musk didn't wake up and say, I want to build electric cars. He said, I want to accelerate sustainable energy, and then asked, what's the biggest obstacle? The answer was that people wouldn't adopt electric vehicles because they weren't desirable. So he didn't build a practical car. He built the most desirable car that happened to be electric. He inverted the problem. This is how they approach everything. They don't ask, what can I do with what I have? They ask, what do I need, and how do I reverse engineer getting it? It sounds simple, but it's psychologically brutal because it forces you to confront all the things you don't have, don't know, and can't do yet. Most people avoid that discomfort. The 1% live in it. They sit in the gap between where they are and where they want to be, and they get comfortable being uncomfortable. That ability to exist in prolonged discomfort without quitting is maybe the most underrated psychological trait of the ultra-wealthy. Now let's talk about time. Because the 1% have a completely different relationship with it. There's a famous study called the Stanford Marshmallow Experiment. Kids were given a choice, eat 1 marshmallow now or wait 15 minutes and get 2. The kids who waited, who had stronger delayed gratification, ended up more successful later in life. Better grades, better jobs, better income. The 1% aren't just good at delayed gratification. They've weaponized it. They're not thinking in 15 minutes. They're thinking in 15 years. Jeff Bezos famously said Amazon thinks in 7-year timelines. Not quarters. Not fiscal years. 7 years. When you're operating on that kind of timeline, short-term losses become irrelevant. Amazon didn't make a profit for years. It was burning cash. Wall Street was skeptical, but Bezos wasn't optimizing for this year's profit. He was optimizing for market dominance a decade later. That's a level of delayed gratification that most people can't even conceptualize, let alone execute. Because delaying gratification for a decade requires you to ignore every external voice telling you you're failing. It requires psychological isolation. Here's the second law: emotional detachment from outcomes. The 1% care deeply about their goals, but they're emotionally detached from individual results. If a deal falls through, they don't spiral. If a business fails, they don't take it personally. They've trained themselves to separate their identity from their results. This is crucial. The average person ties their self-worth to their success. So when they fail, it feels like they failed as a person. The 1% see failure as something that happened, not something they are. That psychological separation is what allows them to take big swings repeatedly. They're not risking their identity, they're risking capital, time, effort. And those are renewable resources, but here's what nobody talks about. This detachment doesn't stay contained to business. It bleeds into relationships, into family, into friendships. When you train yourself not to be emotionally affected by loss in one area, that numbness spreads. You start detaching from everything. That's why so many ultra-successful people have broken marriages, estranged kids, and shallow friendships. They optimize for success and accidentally optimized out connection. The psychology that makes you a billionaire can make you lonely in ways that money will never fix. Let's go deeper into how they think about money itself. There's a concept called scarcity mindset versus abundance mindset, but those terms have been so overused they've lost meaning. So let me reframe it. Scarcity mindset isn't just thinking there's not enough. It's a neurochemical state. When you're in scarcity, your brain is in survival mode. It's focused on threats, on protecting what you have, on not losing. You literally can't think long term because your brain is in fight or flight. Abundance mindset isn't toxic positivity. It's a state where your brain feels safe enough to think strategically, to take risks, to plan decades ahead. The 1% have figured out how to hack themselves into abundance mode even when they're broke. How? By decoupling their psychological state from their bank account. They practice thinking abundantly before they have abundance. They make decisions as if money is infinite before it actually is. And weirdly, that shift in thinking creates the behavior that eventually creates the wealth. It's not manifestation, it's psychology influencing action. When you think abundantly, you take different opportunities. You negotiate differently, you build differently, and over time, reality starts to match mindset. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Not everyone can make this shift. Some people have been in survival mode so long that their brain physically can't switch gears. Chronic stress, financial trauma, poverty, these things change brain structure. The 1% often come from enough stability that their brains have the safety to develop long-term thinking. That's not inspiration, that's neuroscience. And it means the game isn't as fair as hustle culture pretends it is. Let's talk about the third law, strategic ignorance. The 1% are obsessive about what they focus on, which means they're equally obsessive about what they ignore. They don't read the news. They don't follow drama. They don't care about things outside their control. This isn't privilege, it's intentional psychological filtering. The average person consumes everything. Every headline, every crisis, every controversy. And all of that creates mental noise that makes strategic thinking impossible. The 1% have learned that attention is their most valuable resource, and they guard it ruthlessly. Warren Buffett reads for hours every day, but he's not reading news. He's reading annual reports, studying businesses, learning compounding strategies. He's not ignoring the world, he's ignoring the noise so he can focus on signal. That level of focus requires saying no to almost everything. And most people can't do that because they're afraid of missing out. The 1% have made peace with missing out on 99% of things so they can dominate the 1% that matters. Here's the fourth law, system thinking versus event thinking. The average person thinks in events. I need to make this sale. I need to get this promotion. I need to launch this product. The 1% think in systems. They're not trying to make one sale, they're building a sales machine. They're not trying to get promoted, they're building a personal brand that makes them promotable everywhere. They're not launching one product, they're building a system that launches products repeatedly. Event thinking is exhausting because you're constantly starting over. System thinking compounds because every action feeds the machine. Elon Musk isn't managing Tesla day to day anymore. He built a system, a team, a culture, a process that runs without him. That's the goal. Build something that works while you sleep. The 99% trade time for money, which means their income has a ceiling, the hours in a day. The 1% build systems that generate value independently of their time. That's not passive income hustle content. That's the actual psychological shift from labor to leverage. And here's where it gets really dark. The fifth law, moral flexibility. Let's not pretend the 1% got there by being saints. Many of them have crossed ethical lines that the average person wouldn't. They've laid off thousands to boost stock prices. They've exploited tax loopholes. They've prioritized profit over people. This isn't universal, but it's common enough that we have to acknowledge it. The psychology of extreme wealth often requires a numbing of empathy. You can't feel every person affected by your decisions, or you'd never make them. So they develop what psychologists call moral disengagement. They reframe harmful actions as necessary, as strategic, as just business. And here's the thing: society rewards this. We celebrate billionaires while ignoring how they built the empire. We idolize the outcome without questioning the process. The 1% aren't more moral or less moral than anyone else. They've just structured their psychology to prioritize winning over being liked, and that trade-off. Most people aren't willing to make it, which is maybe why most people don't become billionaires. So where does this leave us? The 1% have rewired their brains for leverage, risk, detachment, focus, systems, and yes, sometimes moral compromise. They've killed the parts of themselves that make you relatable and replaced them with parts that make you successful. They see the world as malleable, money as infinite, and failure as tuition. They think in decades while you're thinking in months. They've made peace with being misunderstood, disliked, and isolated as long as they're winning. But here's the final truth. You don't have to become them. You can learn from their psychology without losing yourself. You can adopt long-term thinking without abandoning your relationships. You can take calculated risks without becoming reckless. You can build systems without exploiting people. The 1% aren't the blueprint, they're a case study. Some of their psychology is powerful, some of it's poison. Your job is to figure out which parts make you stronger and which parts make you hollow. Because at the end of the day, the richest person in the graveyard is still just dead. So here's what we've actually uncovered. The 1% aren't operating with secret knowledge. They're operating with different psychological wiring. They see money as leverage, not safety. They see risk as engineered, not avoided. They see failure as data, not identity. They think in systems while most people think in events. They've learned to delay gratification for years, detach emotionally from outcomes, and ignore everything that doesn't serve their mission. That's the formula. That's the rewiring. But here's the part that matters for you. Right now, your brain is probably wired for survival, for protecting what you have, for avoiding loss, for seeking approval. And that wiring makes sense. It kept your ancestors alive, but it won't make you wealthy. Wealth requires a different operating system. One that's comfortable with uncertainty, focused on decades, and divorced from needing external validation. The question isn't whether you can learn this. It's whether you're willing to sacrifice what you'd lose in the process. Because let's be real, thinking like the 1% costs something. It might cost you friendships with people who don't understand your decisions. It might cost you comfort because you'll be sitting in uncertainty for years. It might cost you parts of your empathy because strategic thinking sometimes requires cold calculation. You have to decide if that trade is worth it. Not everyone should make it. Not everyone wants to. And that's completely valid. But if you're still here, if something in this video made your brain light up, then you're probably wired differently already. You probably think longer term than your peers. You probably see opportunities where others see problems. You probably feel out of place in conversations about safety and stability. That's not arrogance. That's just a different psychological framework starting to emerge. The 1% aren't better than you. They just committed to the rewiring earlier. And now you know what that rewiring actually looks like. Start small. Pick one law from this video and test it. Maybe it's thinking in systems instead of events. Maybe it's practicing emotional detachment from one outcome this week. Maybe it's asking, how would I reverse engineer this? Instead of, what can I do right now? You don't have to become a billionaire overnight. You just have to start thinking like someone who could. And over time, that thinking shapes your actions. Those actions shape your results. And those results reshape your reality. The 1% figured this out. Now you have the manual. If you're into this kind of content, subscribe to Just 1% and comment your favorite topic about the top 1% mindset.